Hey, thanks for checking out The Solid Verbal. Now would be a great time to subscribe to the channel for college football content all off season long.
What is the most fascinating thing about Oregon in 2023?
Okay, so good transition because it's very similar to what we talked about with Colorado, except on a much higher level because they won 10 total games. They went 9-3 during the regular season last year. But I have it written down here because I am terrible with words, Ty, and I'm pre-apologizing. Eugene Hostility. Hostel as in a place to stay for foreigners, because Oregon and Dan Lanning brought in a ton of new faces. They signed a big recruiting class. I think it was pushing around 30 guys, and then added a ton from the portal with a focus on defense, I would say, at all three levels. And so what ultimately took Oregon down last year was, well, not belonging on the same field as Georgia to open the season. And then Bo Nix gets hurt late against Washington, but that was a game in which the defense really struggled defending what Michael Penix was able to do in terms of extending the field with his arm, and was just at a terrific day. Washington ran the ball reasonably well. They couldn't get to Michael Penix, though. That was the big thing. Even when they actually broke tackles or whatever, not broke tackles, but were able to get past tackles or to penetrate the offensive line, Michael Penix was talented enough to evade. And so Oregon had, I think, the single worst year in terms of pressures and sacks in decades. And that wasn't the case just earlier because Kayvon Thibodeau existed in green and yellow and black and white. And so what Oregon did is they go after Jordan Burch from South Carolina, former 5-star, who I think was scratching the surface of his ceiling. I think maybe there was some disappointment with him in Columbia. They signed a class with, I believe, 10 defensive linemen in it, many of whom were blue chip. They get Jestin Jacobs, from Iowa at linebacker, who showed a lot of promise. They overhaul their secondary while losing their best corner in Christian Gonzalez. And so they bring in a safety from Ole Miss, a safety, a younger brother of an Oregon player, a safety from Fresno State. They bring in a corner from Alabama. And so the question now is, there are a number of people who are going to be depended upon to generate more pressure, to be great in coverage, to tackle in the open field, who were not on this team last year. And so with the expectation of where the offense should be, and the Washington game being in Seattle, hosting USC, and whatever happens, you're going to have to score a ton of points to beat USC and get a stop here and there, hopefully, against what should be a supercharged USC offense. That is there enough on this defense over the course of the season? And they built up depth, and there's talent there for sure. I think there's still doubt about Tosh Lupoy as a defensive coordinator and play caller. They have a new co-defensive coordinator they bring in from Tulane, Chris Hampton, who's going to coach the safeties and help to organize this defense. Obviously, Dan Lanning's calling card is defense. But the new faces, the new names, lasting over the course of 12 games. Thankfully, no Georgia on the schedule, but you saw it against Oregon State. They blow that deep lead when Oregon State and Damian Martinez on the ground are able to do whatever they wanted against this Oregon front. Oregon was not fitting gaps. They were not tackling. They were gassed. They were ready to move on to bowl season. And so that to me is the difference, is are there dudes to tackle for 12 consecutive games up front? If so, Oregon's going to win a ton. Oregon will absolutely win a ton. But that's the fascinating thing about Oregon is you hire Dan Lanning, you pay him to come across the country, you pay him to recruit the way that he has. This has to be a top 40 defense if Oregon is going to complete its goals, all right, come anywhere close to it. That to me is incredible. And the other name along that defensive front, if the pass rush is everything and was nothing last year, is Mateo Uiagalelei, DJU's little brother. Flashed in the spring game, 5-star prospect on the edge from Southern California, that he, in concert with Jordan Burch coming in from South Carolina, Brandon Dorlus, who's been there forever and is a very talented defensive lineman, the return of some guys who were beat up last year along the defensive line, and adding freshman depth. Is that enough to make this Oregon defense look completely refreshed and new? That to me is the fascinating question. I think the entire season hinges on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's dangerous to start trying to compare the Oregon defense or the way that Dan Lanning is trying to build it to what he did at Georgia.
For sure.
That's not fair to the guys who are at Oregon. If you're an Oregon fan, you got to be pretty excited about the talent that he's amassed. I mean,
Sure.
the defensive line has questions, but it's super deep and talented. How good can it be? We're going to have to reconvene maybe midway through the season and talk about any progress that's been made there. They certainly stand to upgrade across a couple different positions on defense. I mean, that would be great. They were 60th overall in the SP Plus in terms of defense last season, and that's not exactly what I think folks thought they were getting with Dan Lanning. They've gotten the talent part right.
Sure.
It's a matter of now assembling the forces and doing the job on the defensive side. Offensively, I'm actually very curious about the offensive line.
Yeah.
Because 4 new starters, something like that this coming season. They've got a former 5-star who's going to be along the line. They've got a couple transfers that they're bringing in that could obviously help and stem the tide a little bit there, prevent against any kind of drop-off. But this is a team that was pretty good at rushing the football a year ago. I mean, Bo Nix is only one component of it. They should have what I think figures to be a pretty dynamic backfield. And if that line is not firing on all cylinders, that could upset the balance of what I think they're trying to do now in a new Will Stein offense.
They have 3 or 4 guys who played a considerable amount of time last year, but didn't start all the time. And then they hit the portal especially hard. So their presumed starting left tackle was the number 1 tackle in the country 2 recruiting classes
Josh
ago.
Connerly, right?
Josh Connerly. They bring in the right tackle from Rhode Island. He should be playing a Johnny Cornelius. They bring in a longtime starter from Texas, a longtime starter from ECU. They've recruited well along the offensive line. It's new. I think it'll take a little bit of time, but as somebody who pays attention to Oregon, I'm not crazy concerned given the experience, given where the talent level should be, but they also start over sort of at offensive line coach with Adrian Clem leaving for the Patriots, and Oregon brings back a former quality control offensive line, analyst type to Alik Terry from the Minnesota Vikings to coach the offensive line. So that with a new coordinator, with Bo Nix's history of being inconsistent, but then you couple it with what should be a very deep receiving core. They had a USC transfer. They added a ton at receiver. They're thinner at tight end than I think the Oregon coaches would like, but they go 4 deep at quality, if not very, very good running backs. So I think the defense will be counted on more for Oregon to be successful, but the offense has an incredibly high ceiling if the line and Will Stein, new coordinator, come together nicely.
In the spirit of our game grand total,
Yeah.
Oregon's over-under is 9.5. Would you go over or under?
I think over.
Yeah.
I think there are 2 losses because of Utah and SC and Washington. It's just an Oregon State. I think there's too much quality and there's too much that's up in the air. But at its best, meaning the defense comes together nicely and the offense gels quickly. They have Texas Tech early on the road. I think this is an 11-1 team.